Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming out on so early on Saturday morning. I know many of you were probably out last night enjoying the networking opportunities of this conference. So today, I want to talk to you about mercenary spyware. What is mercenary spyware? Well, I'll define it during my talk. If you don't know, don't worry. So who am I? Well, some of you might know me. I'm Bill Marczak. I work at this organization called the Citizen Lab. Citizen Lab's based at the University of Toronto. It's an academic organization. And I have a PhD in computer science from UC Berkeley. And Citizen Lab does a lot of work at the intersection of technology and freedom of expression. So we do work looking at government censorship, government surveillance, policy and law regarding access to information. And we employ a mixture of methods. So I'm a computer scientist by training. We have social scientists, we have lawyers, we have people from all across the academic spectrum that work on this stuff. And mercenary spyware is one of our particular focuses. This is spyware that is sold by companies, often exclusively to governments, an example being the famous Predator spyware, which everyone I think in Greece is very familiar with the scandal, as well as Pegasus and other types of spyware. So mercenary spyware has been on the rise over the past few years, and journalists increasingly find themselves being targeted. This can be an issue, obviously, because journalists need to keep some secrets when they're reporting. Identity of sources, what they're working on. And if this information falls into the hands of adversaries like the government, if they're investigating the government, then this can subvert accountability and the course of the investigation. So it's not good for journalists to be spied on. But how does this actually work? How does the spying actually work, and how has it evolved over time? And what can you do to defend against it? So I'm going to cover all that in this talk today. And the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to jump right in with what will hopefully be an interesting story of something that happened just this month. So for those of you who are phone users, which is probably everyone, you're probably familiar with the constant stream of updates that your phone asks you to install. It's kind of a pain, right? Like, especially this month, there's been iOS 16.6.1 if you're on your iPhone, iOS 17, 17.0.1, 17.0.2. It's kind of a pain to restart your phone, install all this stuff. So what is in these updates? Well, I want to tell you about one update that was released this month, September 21st. iOS 17.0.1 patched some critical vulnerabilities, or some emergency patch that patched critical vulnerabilities in the iPhone. So what does this mean? Well, iOS 17.0.1 fixed 3 vulnerabilities, and vulnerabilities are numbered by CVE here. And what a vulnerability is it's some weakness in software, whether it's the web browser or the OS. And the weakness can be used to subvert the security of your phone. So the specific vulnerabilities, you can see the sort of technical description here. But the translation is basically, well, one of these vulnerabilities would have allowed a bad website that you visit to take control of your web browser. OK, in the web browser, maybe they can do some sort of limited mischief. But there was another vulnerability, which meant that if the attacker had control of your web browser, they could break outside the sandbox that the web browser runs in to isolate it from the rest of the phone. And if they can break out of that, then they can essentially control the phone. And they used a further vulnerability to install a malicious app not approved by Apple. So these vulnerabilities, we at Citizen Lab were able to capture them and disclose them to Apple, and Apple issued this patch. Together, these vulnerabilities constitute what's known as a full exploit chain, a remote jailbreak. These are somewhat technical terms. But basically, what this is a series of vulnerabilities that allow an attacker to install spyware on your phone just by you visiting some malicious website. And these are often somewhat difficult to find, right? Because you have to have very smart people that are working around the clock, scrutinizing the code of Safari and iOS to try and find these really clever ways to subvert their security that Apple or Android or Google in the case of Android didn't intend to include. So back in 2015, if you had a full iOS exploit chain like this, you could sell it for $1 million to an intermediary, in this case a company called Zerodium, which then would go and sell it to governments or mercenary spyware companies who could then use it to hack people. So this was 2015. Now, just a few days ago, this year in 2023, we got a glimpse into the updated pricing of this sort of exploit. Now, obviously, over time, as more and more exploits get patched and fixed, and updates come out, there's fewer ways to break into the phone. So less supply, same amount of demand, or perhaps increasing demand. What's going to happen? Yeah, the price is going to go up. So $20 million is the latest quote that we've heard from 2023, this year. In other words, if you find something like this, you sell it. You get $20 million in your bank account. So in order to capture something like this and disclose it and fix it, that is a lot of investment that a company or a mercenary spyware firm is doing that is suddenly worthless. It's a big deal, in other words. So this was quite a significant coup, but how did we do it? How did we capture this? Well, let me tell you a story, and this will sort of help you understand how we at Citizen Lab work with people in civil society, journalists, activists, opposition politicians, in order to try and help keep all users safe. So we were contacted this month, before the iOS 17.0.1 patch, by this gentleman, Ahmed El-Tantawi, who is an Egyptian politician. He's a former leftist MP, and he's announced that he is intending to run in next year's Egyptian elections against Sisi, who's been the president. He's a military dude, been the president of Egypt for many years now, since there was the military coup. And the government is harassing him. So the government has been arresting his relatives, his friends, and his supporters. And not only that, but he sort of noticed at some point this month, my phone is acting weird. Something suspicious is going on. Now, this is often quite hard to interpret, right? Like, my phone is acting weird is, sort of like a self-diagnosis. Like, how do you know? How can someone know that their phone is acting weird and that this is sort of out of the ordinary and that this might be something worth investigating, right? It's sort of like, maybe self-diagnosing yourself with COVID. It's sort of, you need an expert to take a look. And we often get a lot of people who come to us and say, well, my phone is acting weird. Well, what does that mean? Well, technology is notoriously unreliable, right? Computers and phones might crash or behave abnormally all the time for just no good reason. Maybe there's a poorly coded app that's installed on your phone that's eating up your battery or making the phone hot, and it's not spyware. It's just someone didn't write the app in a efficient manner. However, El-Tantawi was exactly the kind of person who might be targeted because of who he is or what he does. And this is the sort of key that helps drive our engagement at the Citizen Lab with potential targets. Is this person likely to be targeted? And of course, El-Tantawi, opposition politician in Egypt, very repressive government, and furthermore, his friends and family were being arrested. So definitely a good candidate for testing. So we said, let's take a look. So how do we take a look at a phone to determine whether there's any signs of spyware or hacking? Well, obviously hackers don't want to get caught. Because, well, why? Because they might burn a $20 million investment and have it become worthless overnight. Because if the exploits get captured, they get patched, they can no longer be used to target the latest phones. So there's money on the line, right? They're going to try and be as careful as they can to not get caught, to take precautions, to obfuscate or remove the traces of the spyware, and there's a number of ways that they do this. So how can we catch them? Well, it turns out there's no such thing as a quote-unquote perfect crime, right? Someone always makes a mistake. There's always something left behind. Phones are extremely complex. When you're running something on the phone without the user's consent or permission or authorization, there are many ways that might get logged. If you try and then delete the logs, maybe that can be noticed or detected. So it's sort of a cat and mouse game, right? You know, the hackers don't want to get caught, but maybe we can find ways to catch them. So what do? Well, there's two main overall approaches. One of them is called a heuristic-based approach. So these are things that we're looking for that shouldn't be happening on a normally behaving benign phone. So processes running with elevated privileges, or apps that are running in ways that normal apps can't run on the phone. So let's have a brief flashback to 2021, and I'll explain an interesting case that we found then where we were using this heuristic approach. So there was a gentleman in Turkey, Ayman Noor, who's an Egyptian politician, or a former Egyptian politician, and also the owner of a TV station. So he's a journalist. And back in 2021, he said, guys, my phone is running hot. Can you please check it? I'm very suspicious. And, you know, again, like, well, who knows? But he's definitely the kind of person who's likely to be targeted for who he is or what he does. Former opposition politician, journalist of an opposition TV channel that's being beamed by satellite back into Egypt, covering Egyptian affairs. So quite likely that the Egyptian government would want to target him. So we applied our heuristic-based approach. We checked his phone. We were looking for processes, for apps that were running with abnormally elevated permissions, which shouldn't happen in a benign, normal case. And we found something. We found this really weird thing running as root, which is a user on the phone that has elevated permissions. So the thing was called payload 2, which sounds kind of suspicious, payload, right? And furthermore, there was this website listed in the app here, https distdc.com / a bunch of random letters and numbers / stage 3. Sounds a little bit weird, like payloads, stages. Sounds like some kind of a attack, potentially. So what did we do? Well, we looked at this URL. We said, OK, let's just visit this website, distdc.com, with all these random letters and numbers, and see what we get. So what we got was an app. It downloaded an app. It was about 5 megabytes. And we looked through the app, and we found multiple references to this string called Predator, which sounded a little bit weird. Predator installed, run it, got permissions, check for Predator. And through some more work, we were able to understand the behavior of this website, this server, and link it back to a company called Intellexa, which in fact offers a product called Predator. And it is an Android and iOS remote intelligence solution, which is a euphemism for spyware, something that hacks your device, exfiltrates or sends information from the device back to the person who deployed the spyware, and then they can essentially see everything on your phone. So this product allows them to see text messages, listen in on calls, turn on the microphone, turn on the camera, see information from encrypted chat apps, because the information is not actually encrypted until it's sent over the internet. So if the information is being copied while it's on the device, it's not encrypted. So pretty much full access to the device. Anything you can do, the spyware can do. And Intellexa is this sort of umbrella surveillance organization. The specific company we identified that produces Predator was called Citrox, although the corporate structure of these mercenary spyware firms is often somewhat opaque and obfuscated. They operate in many different countries, try and dodge accountability and export controls. So this was quite interesting. Back in 2021, we'd identified that this gentleman, Ayman Noor, had this Predator spyware that was running on his phone. And this then allowed us to build out the second aspect of our detection approach. So no longer are we just focused on heuristics, but now we have signatures. We have this payload 2 thing, which is interesting. We have this weird URL, distdc.com, a website that we can check for. And further, we were able to determine that this payload app, or this payload 2 app, was launched through this feature that you have on your iPhone, which probably not many of you have used, which is called Siri automations. So this is a way to enable something on the phone to execute in a automated and transparent fashion when a certain condition is met. So when you open an app, do something. When the phone is turned on, do something. And this can run silently in the background. So essentially, the spyware had installed this so that every time the phone booted up, the spyware was automatically launched and run and began sending information back. So these things, the automation, the process names, the website names, allowed us to build up what we call signatures. So specific things that we're looking for that are attributable to a specific type of spyware. So we can say, aha, not only was this phone hacked, but it was hacked with Predator and not some other type of spyware. So that was cool. Anyway, back to our current story of Mr. El-Tantawi. So he's wondering, hey, was I hacked? My phone is acting weird. So when we checked his phone, when we do these checks, we don't actually need to have physical access to the phone. We instruct the target to extract some information and share it with us. And then we examine that information to look for these signatures, and we also apply these heuristics. So in fact, we found that 2 years ago, in 2021, this automation for installing Predator was installed on his phone. So yes, he was hacked in 2021. And one of the things that we can do is once we have a specific date and time, you look and see what else was happening on the phone around that date and time. And lo and behold, we found this dodgy-looking SMS message. Why is it dodgy? Well, it purports to be from WhatsApp, the popular chat app. But if you look very closely at that link, it's WHATSS-APP. So WhatsApp only has one S, and it's also .com, and this is WhatsApp with two S's, .co. And we were able to determine that Mr. El-Tantawi had read this message. In other words, it was unread, but then he clicked on it, and it opened the message, and he had read it. And this happened approximately 2 minutes and 33 seconds earlier. We weren't able to see whether he clicked on the link or not because that information is not preserved for a period of 2 years on the phone. But we suspect that this link was how he was infected from tapping on it. And of course, the idea of this sort of social engineering to get you to click on the link is to create urgency. So if you look at the text of this message, well, it's saying, hey, your WhatsApp might be hacked. You got to take some urgent action, clicking on this link to keep your account safe. I'm sure that there are many people in the world who would click on this link without looking too closely. And that's the goal of this sort of social engineering. Create this urgency, get you to click without vetting it, without looking too carefully. So slowing down can be effective here, and really scrutinizing these messages before clicking. So anyway, this is 2 years ago, right? Like, who cares? He didn't really announce his candidacy for presidency back in 2021 because the election's in 2024. So he's wondering, well, was I hacked this year? Was I hacked recently? Was I hacked after I announced my intention to challenge Sisi for the presidency? So good question. We noticed something a little bit odd in September 2023, this month. So we noticed in his database on his phone that records his web history. So we checked this, and we saw that El-Tantawi tried to visit this website for Al-Ahali newspaper, a progressive Egyptian newspaper. And when he visited this website, the website did not properly implement something you may have heard of in web browsers called HTTPS or SSL. This is a way to secure and authenticate the connection between your phone and the web server to ensure that the data sent between them is not being tampered with, or it's genuine for what the server intended to send you. So when he visited this website, the website did not properly implement HTTPS, so the connection was unauthenticated, unencrypted. And when he tried to visit it, he never got there. He was instead redirected to this dodgy website, c.betly.me, which is not related to the Al-Ahali newspaper. And furthermore, the mechanism by which he was redirected left this signature that had this header that said via 1.0 middle box. Middle box. So that was kind of odd, but we'll come back to that later. So we had this interesting link, right? So this redirect should not have really happened if he was communicating with the website and the traffic was not being tampered with. So we thought it was interesting. So we clicked on it, and Boom, that's how we got the exploit chain. So when we clicked on that, the exploits were sent to the web browser, and a payload was downloaded, an app. So the spyware was similar to the previous Predator sample. Now, they had, obviously, since we had published on this 2021 attack and said, hey, we found the sample, it had the words Predator all over it, the word Predator no longer appeared in the sample. So they had removed that, but there were still structural similarities that were sufficient to make the attribution back. So our report that we published at Citizen Lab goes into the sort of technical details of that, but they're perhaps not super interesting for this discussion. But the important thing is we were able to make that attribution because of the structural similarities indicated that the authors of the two samples were almost certainly the same. So we were able to tell him, hey, you were targeted with Predator as recently as September 2023. Targeted, but was he hacked? Did the spyware successfully get installed on his phone? He was redirected to this dodgy site, but did it work? Did the attack work? Was any of his personal information actually stolen? Turns out, no, it wasn't. And the reason is kind of interesting. So he had enabled this feature, which is an optional feature on the iPhone, called lockdown mode. So this was introduced with iOS 16, and if you turn it on, it disables certain features of the phone. And it turns out that one of the features that it disables was a particular feature in Safari, which was exactly the feature that was exploited by these exploits. So if this had run on his phone, lockdown mode would have blocked the attack, which is good. So he didn't appear to get infected in this case. OK, so that was a relief for him. But there's still this mystery. How was he targeted? What's this weird middle box thing that we saw, right? He didn't receive an SMS with a dodgy link that he clicked. This was something he was intending to visit a legitimate, benign website, yet when he tried that, he was redirected to a malicious website. So let's go back and dig in a little bit to this middle box thing. So you could look up middle box on Wikipedia and get sort of a formal definition. Basically, a middle box refers to any sort of device that is manipulating internet traffic or internet requests as they flow across the internet. So some of you might be familiar with the concept, right, of internet censorship. Certain countries will block various websites, whether they're political websites, news websites, adult content. And this is done by way of a middle box, which observes the request and terminates the request, so you can't access the banned content. But in this case, the middle box was being used for some interesting type of tampering, this redirection, right? So conceptually, what's going on here is we have Mr. El-Tantawi's phone, and his phone is on his mobile subscribers, or his mobile network, Vodafone Egypt, and he's communicating, or he's attempting to communicate, with this Al Ahali newspaper website, which of course is an Egyptian website, but like many websites, hosted on some random hosting company that's located in Europe, or in this case, the United States. So the path between Mr. El-Tantawi's phone and Al Ahali newspaper goes from Egypt to the United States. And somewhere in the middle of this path is this middle box, which is intercepting his request, terminating it, and then redirecting him to the spyware. So he tries to access the website for this newspaper, which is alahaligate.com. The middle box intercepts it, terminates the request, sends back the redirect to the spyware. But where is this middle box, right? The path between him in Egypt and this website physically in the United States, it probably goes through Europe, a bunch of other countries, and intermediate internet service providers. So this really could be anywhere from right in his network to somewhere in the United States. So we have to understand where this middle box is in order to attribute this. Is this the Egyptian government, or is this someone else, something else? Is this targeted at him, or could this be random? So possibility one is the middle box is really, really close to him, like in a van outside his house, right? And we know that Intellexa is famous for surveillance vans, because there was this really great reporting by Forbes back in, 2018, or a few years ago, where a Forbes reporter went and interviewed Tal Dilian, who is this head honcho, former Israeli Unit 81 military intelligence dude, who was living in Cyprus, not quite sure where he is now, but he's the sort of head honcho of Intellexa, and he dramatically stepped out of the shadows for this Forbes article and said, Forbes, I'd love to show you my $9 million surveillance van that can hack into your phone. So there's pretty incredible videos here where the Forbes reporter is just, like walking through this van and Teledillion's explaining everything. And the important thing here is that this can intercept, manipulate traffic, hack into devices. So it was sort of a legitimate question, like, is there just a van sitting outside his house that's tampering with his internet connection and trying to hack his phone? Or another possibility is it's sort of deeper in the network, right? Like, it's not outside his house. Maybe it's installed in some switching closet somewhere in Vodafone's network, right? Vodafone is his mobile network in this case. Or it could be even further, outside of Vodafone's network, somewhere in Europe, somewhere in the United States. So in order to understand who's spying on him, we have to understand where this is. So how do we do this? Well, we published the sort of technical details in our report this month at Citizen Lab's website. You can delve into that. But basically, the sort of high-level point is there is a way. When you're sending a request on the internet, you can control how many intermediate, what are called routers, handle that request before it gets dropped. So you can say, I only want one intermediate router, or two intermediate routers, or three intermediate routers to handle this request. And when the request is dropped, the router that drops it sends you a message back and says, hello, I'm a router on Telecom Egypt's network, and I dropped your request because the time to live was exceeded. So you can use this to understand the path. Where are things going between Vodafone Egypt and this website? And furthermore, if you set the time to live to a certain value and you see the injected response, the spyware redirect coming back, then you know that at that time to live value is the middle box. And then you can see what are the routers on either side, which networks do they belong to, and you can localize it. So we did this. And we were able to rule this out. So it was not outside his house. And in fact, what we found is that the middle box that was injecting the spyware was somewhere between Vodafone Egypt and Telecom Egypt's network. So between two Egyptian networks, it's in Egypt. So this middle box is physically in Egypt. The spyware redirect is physically being injected from somewhere in Egypt, not outside his house, but in the backbone of Vodafone's network. And we were also able to determine that this was targeted. So other Vodafone subscribers who were accessing this website were not being redirected to the same spyware, so targeted. The interesting prospect here, right, is if this is targeted, somehow this middle box is being tied into Vodafone's network where the attacker can select certain subscribers to Vodafone's network and then essentially target them. So whenever they visit a website which is not using HTTPS, which sooner or later all of us will do. So when that happens, then the middle box leaps into action, redirects the target to the spyware, and potentially they can get infected with spyware. So it's a very stealthy way to deliver this stuff without relying on the target to click on a link. But what is this middle, how should we visualize what this middle box is? Well, it turns out we were actually able to fingerprint the small little details of how this redirect happened, right? So a redirect is a very high-level goal. You want to redirect someone to a website. It's like, well, you want to drive someone from the hotel to the conference venue. Well, which route do you take? What sort of car do you send, right? There's a lot of what we call in computer science degrees of freedom. In other words, you give someone a high-level instruction, but how do you implement it? So we were able to measure the details of the implementation of the redirect and match it with a specific product from a specific company. And it's this. This is essentially what the middle box is. It's a device called Packet Logic, which is manufactured by a company called Sandvine, formerly known as Procera. So we were able to actually acquire one of these boxes, test its behavior, and match its behavior to what we saw in the case of Egypt. So that was pretty cool. But at the end of the day, what precisely does this mean, right? Okay, so we've identified this opposition candidate in Egypt who was targeted with spyware. We've attributed the spyware to a company. We've captured the exploits. Apple's released a patch. We've identified the manufacturer and the specific type of device that was used to inject the spyware. But what does this mean in practice, right? Okay, you found spyware, good job. Like, does it really mean anything? Well, what this allows us to do is understand the evolution of these attacks, right? Because we've got this individual targeted in 2021, targeted in 2023. And the 2023 targeting is far stealthier, right? There's no need to fall for some bait message. So you can't really instruct users to be vigilant and avoid clicking, because even if they avoid clicking, they're still going to be browsing the web, and at some point they'll visit an insecure website, and the middle box will attack them. It's also a little bit harder to prove what happened in these cases, right? The only reason we were able to measure this spyware injection and attribute it was because we were in the right place at the right time. This sort of spyware injection is an ephemeral event, right? It might only be happening for a short period of time. It's only happening for a certain user or targeted users. So you have to be in touch with those targeted users at the right time, right when they're being attacked, in order to measure it. So it's harder to prove what happened and harder to attribute and achieve accountability unless you get really lucky. So what I'm essentially saying here is this is probably the tip of the iceberg, right? This is probably going on a much larger scale in additional countries in the world that are predator customers. But we don't know because it's really, really hard to detect and measure. So, okay, this is an example of this evolution, things becoming stealthier, but where are things going, right? Like, so this is one interesting innovation in the spyware space, but what other things are on the horizon? Well, there was a great report recently from Haaretz, a newspaper in Israel, and it sort of observed that there was this new sort of technology that Israeli firms were trying to export in order to deploy spyware more stealthily. And what it essentially was is a way to deliver spyware through an ad that you see. And a lot of us see ads, right, in the browser, on YouTube, inside apps, on our mobile devices. And these ads are delivered through a complex process where advertisers bid for certain audiences in order to show ads and hope that the target will interact with the ad to generate revenue for the advertiser. But if the attacker has some vulnerability they can deploy through the ad, and they can deploy the ad in a micro-targeted way just at you, then they can use it to infect your device. So this is a technology that's been developed, not only by Israeli firms, but other firms too. And it's sort of lurking on the horizon. You know, it might be going on, but again, it's very hard to measure and very hard to detect. But this is where the sort of next evolution, I think, is in terms of stealthiness. There's also this worrying trend of zero-click attacks. And we had an example of this this month, actually, earlier in the month. There was a zero-click attack that we detected that we disclosed to Apple, and it was fixed in iOS 16.6.1. Essentially, this vulnerability involved the code on your phone that processes images. In other words, that converts the bits and bytes that you receive on the internet into something that's displayed visually on your phone's screen. So it turns out there was a pretty scary vulnerability in one of these image decoding libraries, which was used to attack people through iMessage. So the attackers sent malicious images through iMessage. The images were never actually displayed on the screen, but when the phone tried to display them, because when you get a message, your phone gives you a little preview at the top saying, blah, 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 messaged you, and there's a little tiny thumbnail. So in the process of generating that really tiny thumbnail for the notification, the attacker was able to hijack control of the phone and install spyware. This is pretty stealthy because there's really nothing you can do to defend yourself against it, aside from enabling features like lockdown mode, which I'll get to. So how can you reason about, or how can you navigate these sorts of dangers? Well, one of the things that I hear a lot, right, after I sort of give these talks is, oh, well, there's really nothing we can do. All hope is lost. This stuff is really hard to prevent. I'll just assume I'm always under surveillance. Well, that's not true, there are definitely ways to do things that will do what we call in computer science reducing your attack surface. In other words, reducing the opportunities that attackers can use to hack you. So think about chat apps, right? And think about these sorts of zero-click attacks, like attacks involving your phone trying to display images. You probably have a lot of chat apps on your phone, right? Like you might have Signal, WhatsApp, Telegram, Facebook Messenger, Skype, WeChat, Line, Viber, Threema, Wire, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And maybe you don't use them all that much, right? Like maybe you installed an app once to communicate with a source, and then you don't really use it anymore, but the app is still on your phone. Well, all of these sorts of apps are vectors by which an attacker can target you. If they figure out your username or phone number or identifier on one of these services, well, they can send you a message. And if there's a vulnerability in one of these apps, either with displaying images or somehow parsing the complex message structures that are exchanged and sent through these apps, then the attacker can leverage that and hack your phone. So one way to reduce your attack surface is to uninstall apps that you're not using. It sounds kind of simplistic, right? But it can actually make a tangible difference. From time to time, there are zero-click attacks through certain apps. There was a famous case a few years ago of a WhatsApp hack, where targets received these WhatsApp missed calls, but in the process of negotiating the encryption for the call, there was an attack conducted and the phone was hacked. So reducing your attack surface, uninstalling chat apps you don't use. Chat apps are specifically of interest because they are constantly running code in the background to display and process messages that are being pushed to them. Another thing you can do is turn on lockdown mode if you have an iPhone. And if you don't have an iPhone, if you have an Android, there's nothing exactly identical, but there is something somewhat similar called the Google Advanced Protection Program, which, if you opt into it, will disable certain types of apps from running on your phone. So lockdown mode, however, we've been able to document that it actually blocks real attacks. It prevented Mr. Altantawi from getting hacked. Not only that, but it has blocked the past 2 exploits that NSO Group and their Pegasus spyware have used to hack into phones. This screenshot here is a sort of funny example of notifications that were generated when a target was hacked. Now, obviously, if you see this, it's not guaranteed that it's a target trying to hack you or someone trying to hack you. But in this case, we had targets notified, I think it was last year, in an attack by lockdown mode. So yeah, quite interesting. It's a good feature to enable. It does disable certain features on the phone, but you probably won't notice any inconvenience. And yeah, that's my talk. Hopefully you took away some ideas that, it's not hopeless. There are things to do to protect yourself. And also the sort of evolution of these attacks becoming stealthier, becoming harder to detect, becoming harder to attribute. It's funny, the spyware is often sold to governments under the guise of, terrorists and criminals are going dark, right? We need spyware to hack their phones and see what they're up to. And of course, the spyware gets abused. But the other side of the problem is that these spyware firms are in some sense going dark because the attacks are becoming stealthier, becoming harder to detect, becoming harder to attribute, which is why not only this sort of technical investigation is important, but it's also super important for journalists to be digging in to the corporate structure of this industry, to the deals that are going on. And we've seen really incredible work on that here in Greece with journalists like Inside Story. We've seen really incredible work in Israel, where a lot of the industry is based, from journalists like Haaretz newspaper. And it's this sort of work, digging into the stuff, whether through open source intelligence or sourcing, is extremely important in illuminating this industry, which is really trying to remain in the shadows. So thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions. I think we might have about maybe 10 minutes for questions. Okay, I think you raised your hand first. Do we have we have a microphone, great.
Hi, my name is Dimitris Serdais. I'm studying in IAC Omeros, Astronomist Aegean College. I'm studying journalism. This is my second year. And I have one question. It's in the last few years, this one phenomenon which world channels for social media accounts from journalists, media sites, all of this time, politicians we hacked by Russian hackers. Those accounts were turned into crypto scam promoting scams like crypto, porn. Not only the accounts, but also their personal data. Do you think it's such related to what you just presented here?
So it's an interesting question, right? So you're asking about these, really popular scams, which in some cases hack people's accounts and use it to disseminate the scam further. So it's true that there's a lot of these, sorts of scams and financially motivated attacks. Those can potentially pose, obviously, risk to your finances and to your personal information. However, those sorts of attacks are not really what we focus on at the Citizen Lab. We're mainly looking at these cases where when information is taken, it can be used against the journalist, against the sources, to try and subvert accountability, to put people in harm's way. Now, you could argue, yes, your money's being stolen, some scam is being promoted, that's harmful. Those sorts of attacks, though, it turns out, are relatively well detected and subverted by any sort of large-scale attack like that is relatively well detected or subverted by the sort of teams at these companies like WhatsApp or Facebook that deal with threat intelligence and deal with scams. Things which are very widespread are a bit easier to detect and shut down and remediate against, whereas we at Citizen Lab are focused on these very highly targeted attacks which don't really register on the radar of a lot of these companies. Yes? Oh.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. I just wanted to ask, there's been a lot of activism lately with regards to cybersecurity threats and spyware, and this cyber activism phenomenon has gained a lot of traction recently. I just wanted to ask if this is enough, since governments and institutions are not taking responsibility, and where would you draw the line of accountability in this case?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I think that any sort of activism that either raises awareness about the dangers or specifically targets some of the players in the industry is extremely valuable. Ultimately, activism can translate in some cases into concrete policy changes. For instance, one really good policy change we saw recently was the United States Commerce Department applied pressure on Israel to tweak its export controls a little bit and prevent some exports to, shall we say, more repressive governments. But I think that there can always be more, right? Because at its core, the problem of spyware abuse it's a little bit of a technical problem, but it's also a problem of oversight and accountability. So ensuring that governments have these sorts of structures of checks and balances and oversight is critical to ensure that if there is surveillance technology in use, it's being properly applied against criminals and terrorists and not being abused. In terms of accountability, yeah, I think there's this case is particularly interesting in Egypt because we have the spyware company. Obviously they should be accountable, but we also have this company that sold this middle box, this technology to manipulate internet traffic, and they could sort of always argue, well, middle boxes are they have potential useful benign applications, and we're just selling the technology. We're not controlling what they do with it, and the technology is not explicitly designed for surveillance, so it's a little bit trickier. But I would say that companies that are exporting technology which can be misused, they have an obligation to ensure that they're doing business with customers who are not going to abuse it, or if they do uncover cases of abuse, they cut off support, they sort of take remediative action. But it is sort of, as you point out, a very tough to obtain accountability in these cases, and I think that's why activists continuing to push for accountability is and changes in terms of like oversight and surveillance practices is important. Yeah. Oh, I think there was, yeah.
Hello, and thank you very much for your keynote. Would commercially available tools like mobile antivirus or VPN provide some sort of safety against the threats that you mentioned, or are they not relevant?
That's a great question. So regarding the use of a VPN in this case would have prevented the injection from succeeding, because the VPN sort of applies, it basically like routes all of your traffic through this magical encrypted tunnel, which is ideally located outside of Egypt. So there's not, if you're accessing a website that's not using HTTPS, it doesn't necessarily matter within the context of Egypt, because that is never passing unencrypted through your Egyptian telecom. It's in this magical encrypted tunnel, which might be exiting somewhere in Europe, and then from that point in Europe to the website in the United States, it's unencrypted, but that would remove the opportunity for the, this middle box on Vodafone's network to tamper with the unencrypted portion. So a VPN would have prevented this sort of attack, but VPNs also have their own sort of privacy issues, right? Like, who is the company offering you the VPN? Do you trust their privacy practices? Maybe they're logging all of your information and selling it for commercial gain. Maybe they're cooperating with the government. So VPNs can be a little tricky, which is why it's so important to vet the company and understand the privacy practices of the company. For those of you interested in VPNs, there's a resource called the Security Planner. You can Google for Security Planner and find it. It's hosted by this American organization called Consumer Reports, and there's a couple recommendations of good VPNs to use there that have reasonable privacy practices and security practices. Regarding mobile antivirus apps, antiviruses are really great at detecting widespread threats, threats that target thousands and thousands of people. For these very highly targeted threats, antiviruses are not good. Why? Because the attackers test against the antivirus. The company, Citrox Intellexa, developing the Predator spyware, just goes and buys copies of the antivirus software and says, does this mobile antivirus detect my spyware? Does this one detect it? Does this one detect it? And then how is it detecting it? How can we tweak our spyware or modify it so that it's not triggering the detection? So that's sort of the problem of antiviruses regarding targeted attacks. But if the attacker is targeting thousands and thousands of people, they can't really design against all the various types of antiviruses. Something will get flagged eventually and detected. So that's not to say that mobile antivirus is useless. It is useful in blocking these sorts of widespread attacks, but don't expect it to block Predator. I've sort of lost track of who's next, so maybe I'll just go this way. Yeah.
I really salute Citizen Lab for the work you are doing. It's great. I don't know what we will be doing without Citizen Lab, Amnesty Tech, and Access Now. And it's great that you simplified, although you are from the technical computer science side, to us what's happening. First, is it the budget that is put into this, the industry, so our colleagues can understand how much does it really cost? And are we really knowing the massive surveillance that's happening, because many people are not testing and their mobiles are not doing funny things. So in some countries, we think that many people are aware and they do test and they do contact Citizen Lab, but many others are not. And we were surprised with junior people, not very famous journalists, that have been attacked. So are we really seeing the tip of the ice in this thing that we really don't know what is it? Thank you.
Great question, yeah. And I think it very much is the tip of the iceberg. Absent these sorts of large, investigations and leaks, like we saw, for instance, with the Pegasus project back in 2021. There was this leaked list of 50,000, I think, phone numbers that were said to have been subject to surveillance or subject to targeting by Pegasus. So absent those sorts of large leaks or data sets, it's really hard to understand the scope of what's going on. And of course, there's other surveillance firms besides Pegasus. There's Predator. There's dozens of other companies. So yeah, I think it is important to get tested. There's really few ways, I think, aside from these sorts of really important journalistic investigations and collaborations like Forbidden Stories, Pegasus Project, there's few ways aside from that to get that sort of ground truth about the scale of the surveillance and who's being spied on. So work of journalists is critical. people should get tested if they're at risk. Citizen Lab, of course, as you pointed out, is not the only organization that does that. A really good resource that I can point people to is the Access Now digital helpline. So just go to accessnow.org. You can also Google for it or use your favorite search engine to search for it. This is a place where journalists, activists, dissidents can go and get support, not only for phone testing, but also for any sorts of issues they might encounter with their digital security, whether it's, hey, I got this dodgy message, ooh, my account got taken over and I need to get it back, or I'd like to get my phone checked. So I think it's important for people to get their phones checked, and as you say, people might not notice things that are suspicious. It's a tricky problem, right? Which is why I think it's important for organizations, and we try and do this at Citizen Lab, and other organizations like Amnesty Tech and Electronic Frontier Foundation also try this as well, which is targeted outreach. So if we identify a case in a community, we try and do targeted outreach to get in touch with people and offer them the option of being tested. We also do testing at various large gatherings or events. For those of you who are at the forum in Gothenburg a few weeks ago, we had a Citizen Lab booth there that was doing testing. So I encourage your friends or colleagues who you think might be at risk to go to one of these events or contact Access Now or contact us or someone else. Great question. Yes.
Thank you very much. First of all, ευχαριστούμε for the great presentation on the Human Connectivity show. My name is Lena Kiropoulos. I belong to European Association Journalists. I would like to ask you, because some weeks ago I was hacked, the bank didn't take the responsibility. And today, thanks to your presentation, I have realized the mechanism, how they have cloned the data, etc. But as a specialist, do you think there is a specific program or virus to get protected from this kind of threats?
Good question. I think, yeah, there's not really a specific, a sort of silver bullet of like one thing you can do. And the reason is that the companies that are developing this are very careful about ensuring that their spyware is not blocked or not detected. So they test against antivirus products. They try and subvert the security precautions built into your phone. So there's not really any sort of silver bullet. I think it's a bunch of small steps that you can take to, each step that you take increases the security a little bit. Slowing down when clicking on links, turning on things like lockdown mode or Google Advanced Protection. Like perhaps in certain countries when you're traveling to places where you think you might be at risk from things like network injection, using a recommended VPN could help. Uninstalling these sorts of apps that you might not be using, that are chat apps that might be processing data automatically. And obviously, if you see something that's suspicious on your phone, you get a weird-looking message, something else doesn't look right, you can reach out to Access Now. Citizen Lab as well can assist. So I think, yeah, it's just a bunch of small steps. There's no silver bullet, unfortunately. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Angelica from Buenos Aires, Argentina, La Nación. I'm going to ask you about the live communication, like when we heard many cases in Argentina about releasing spyware or spying different politicians or journalists, it was always like the old-fashioned hearings of phone hearings.
Right.
But the perception, and now in the digital world, we see a lot of emails, interceptions or WhatsApp messages, voice recorded, but not the same as the live communication. So, what are the secure measures, or is it possible to intercept also the Zoom, the Meet, the Teams, or WhatsApp Live, or is it different because they are not releasing those cases?
It's a great question, and the short answer is it depends on the app. So there are apps like Signal or WhatsApp that you can use where the voice data or the video data is encrypted between the communicating parties. So even if someone manages to intercept the data in the middle somewhere, like they're intercepting internet traffic or they're intercepting data from WhatsApp servers, it's all still encrypted, and they won't be able to understand what's being said or what's being communicated. So that's a technology called end-to-end encryption, and that's used by Signal and WhatsApp. Now, there's other platforms like Zoom or Google Meet or I don't know, Microsoft Teams, like those sorts of things, Skype, which don't always necessarily use end-to-end encryption, meaning that if someone were to get data directly from the company, like go to Microsoft and say, hey, can you share data from this, Teams session or something? Now, Microsoft would probably not want to do that, but maybe they could be legally compelled. The data might be available for them to see. So I would say that, really, like many things, it really depends, first and foremost, on your threat model. Who are you worried about intercepting these communications? If it's the local government, let's say in Argentina, well then maybe it might be enough to use a service like Google Meet or something where the servers are not in Argentina, so it might be a bit harder for the Argentinian government to legally compel Google to share information. Or if you're a little bit more concerned, you could use something that's end-to-end encrypted like WhatsApp or Signal. But all bets are off if there's spyware on the device. Spyware on the device can intercept things while you're having the conversation, turning on the microphone, turning on the camera, and seeing what's going on. So the spyware can sort of like subvert that. But if, as we've seen in this talk, spyware can be like expensive, $20 million for this chain of exploits. So it's not used in 100% of cases. It's not really a mass surveillance tool. It's a very, very targeted surveillance tool. Yeah.
Hi, Erin Baker from Time Magazine. Companies like Predator or Pegasus, are they paying these up to $20 million rewards themselves, or is this an internal vulnerability team looking for it? And either way, are they criminally liable for this kind of activity?
Great question. Well, so often it's not, Predator or Pegasus, the companies behind them are not necessarily directly soliciting from the public these vulnerabilities. They might be purchasing them through intermediaries, through developers that they have relationships with, or in some cases developing them themselves. Something you develop yourselves is perhaps more valuable because no one else is using it, so you have full control over its use. And the idea is if you have more control, maybe you can prevent security researchers from capturing it and getting it patched. So it's not necessarily the companies directly, but as for criminal liability, it's interesting. And I think it's one of the reasons why we see this industry selling pretty much exclusively to governments, because they sort of have this fig leaf, right? They can say like, oh, well, we only sell to governments, and governments generally have legal authority to, execute wiretaps or intercept people's communications. So we develop this technology, they can use it, the government, we require the government to solemnly swear that they are using it in accordance with their local laws, and therefore we're not liable. So that's their argument, and the spyware industry in the timeline of court cases and legal actions is very new, right? Because court cases are very slow. So the courts haven't necessarily perhaps yet caught up with this question of liability. And it will also depend, of course, on there's sort of the notion of criminal liability, but also civil liability. So there's cases going on right now where victims are suing the companies and saying, hey, NSO Group, hey, Citrox, you're liable for my damages from being hacked, the abuse of the spyware, because you didn't either properly vet the customer or something like this. So those are playing out. We'll see how the various legal jurisdictions and legal frameworks respond to those cases. But yeah, the short answer is, I guess we will see where things go. Oh, I'm getting the signal to stop. So thank you. If you have additional questions, I'll be available.